This is an audio version of the first two sections of a planned series of political writings gathered under the name Antipolitik. I am not certain if I will ever complete this project because of my complicated relationship with politics. I am fascinated by political philosophy even as I find it to be a largely hopeless enterprise. Thus, I've written these essays without any aspiration that they should ever manifest in the form of action. Politics, as I understand it, exists only in the form of action. Theorizing is not itself a form of political activity. Perhaps most political theorists have written with the opposite conviction that theory can inspire, strengthen, provide weapons that will eventually become useful in a real political struggle. Without this conviction, the goal of my project must remain unintelligible. It is difficult to sustain one's motivations for writing under such conditions. Nevertheless, I believe that the first two sections form a relatively coherent image of the political, birthed out of a polemic that I am forced to recognize as the true object of this work. Perhaps I am simply obstinate in my judgments about the way things really are, and this arms me with a kind of disdain for all the self-serving idealisms that usually represent the true logic of political philosophy. If nothing else, perhaps these essays can provide an ounce of clarity as regards to political problems for whatever good that might do. While I had originally planned to keep this project separate from the podcast and wait until I had a finished product to publish, I've decided instead to gamble based on my sense for the modern discourse. Put simply, less people would read or hear these words, were they compiled into a book. This doesn't mean that I plan to stop writing books or to discard this medium altogether, only that I have decided not to be so precious about hoarding my insights for release on the printed page. Perhaps if there is an enthusiastic response to this audio version of these two sections of this planned project, it will inspire me to eventually complete it. But there is one limitation of the audio format that must be addressed here. Throughout this text, I will use the term war in the sense employed by Thomas Hobbes, and to indicate that this is a distinct term from the ordinary word war, I have rendered it in the text in Hobbes' original spelling, W-A-R-R-E. The distinction I am trying to draw shall become, I hope, clear over the course of these essays. Thus, even though war in its original spelling could be said roughly the same way as war, the ordinary word, I've opted to pronounce Hobbes' spelling whenever this distinct concept is invoked as war, which is, from my understanding, probably a bit closer to the way the word was pronounced in Hobbes' time, although it must be said that the pronunciation has not shifted very much, and I'm going to emphasize the difference in pronunciation, perhaps more than it should be emphasized, in order to distinguish the terms. And so, submitted for your consideration, here are the first two sections of Antipolitik, the birth of the state at the end of war, and Anti-Schmitt. 1. The birth of the state at the end of war. Quote, "Out of civil states there is always war of every one against every one. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or in the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace." End quote. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, Chapter 13. Political life is inaugurated upon the obviation of war. Only where peace has been established can man practice politics. Man is called the political animal, but he cannot be so called in the state of nature, war. It is only under the protection of laws and the auspices of civic religion that he becomes such an animal. This is why the political life is so often utilized to define what is human. Within the magic circle drawn by the state, the essentially human activity can begin. The philosophers of both Hellenic Greece and spring and autumn China continually invoke the idea of an essential separation between the dweller of the polis and the barbarian, between the tame and the civilized. Socrates and Confucius alike contrast the truly human being with the one who is without virtue and learning, and thus who behaves in a way that is not essentially different from the animals. Aristotle's conception of politics was that its aim is to seek the good. In this, he articulates a logical necessity known to all ancient political philosophers. That is, ethics and politics are inextricably linked. First, because the state must clear a peaceful space within the chaos of war, the natural human condition, such that virtue can become practicable. Second, in that the state and its protective walls remain effectively guarded only so long as its watchmen also keep an eye on the moral telos of the state. War is man's natural condition because outside of the state, force can push in any direction as far as it will until it is stopped by a more powerful force. Every impulse, drive, seeks immediate release, which externalizes itself into the use of force. Forces are checked by nothing other than opposing forces. War is innocent. Morality cannot sprout or even take root in the chaos of contesting forces, and man lives without a moralistic conception of good and bad. For our purposes, we must distinguish morality as it is usually spoken of and understood from the evaluative judgments which comprise any act of perceiving or grasping or acting upon reality. The impulse itself judges the object of its desire to be good, and that which thwarts or threatens the pursuit of that desire as bad. To the extent that the drive is brought into consciousness, these evaluations become associated with images and signifiers. Through the operations of language, these signifiers become fixed and determinate. One may question the degree to which language would even be possible for a people who were, quote, stateless, for here we must understand the state as any cramp iron, Nietzsche's term, that can constrain the discharge of impulses and thus halt the external expressions of a group of forces, thus relating the forces into one body, a unity of tension and domination. Even the tribe of a few hundred nomads has established a state when such a body has been formed, such that the discharge of force is constrained under a code of mores enforced by the collective. Inside the magic circle, force cannot move freely. Many or even most channels for expression may be barred. Drive is pushed into a limited series of pathways. Above all, the constituents of the political body cannot be allowed to freely use physical force, violence, against one another, except perhaps under certain designated conditions or situations. For without this fundamental restraint, the state cannot be established. Man's natural condition of war therefore persists until the point at which physical force between constituents is restricted. Against members of the same body, physical force can still be used, but is solely the purview of the state, which in the ancient world usually took an aristocratic form. Force now serves a regulative function. All other physical externalizations of force are directed outward to opposing states or those outside of states. In both possible movements of force, inward and outward, freedom in its purest sense has been successfully abolished, the exception being the one who holds the reins of state and who can therefore steer the direction of the movement. Only the sovereign is free. Let us not mistake what freedom designates in the state of war. It is never a question of free and unfree wills, but of strong and weak wills, as Nietzsche reminds us. The unchecked force at every given moment is free, even if there is a theoretically stronger force right on the other side of the nearest hill. Should a force ever become checked and thus regulated by a greater force, it has lost its freedom, which is in reality the experience of the power to gratify impulse at will. Whether this regulation arrives in the form of a polity which affords the individual member rights as well as responsibilities, or whether the individual is made into a purely subservient function by an act of enslavement, the checked force must now practice deference. Literally, his activity is deferred. Thus, there are countless ways in which the state can arise and countless forms that it can take. But its essential nature is its regulative quality that halts the free movement of forces within its established body. In the vulgar mercantile slang of modern times, we refer to this concept as the state's monopoly on violence. For all his idealist flights of fancy, Hegel was sober and lucid when he conceived of the bondsman as one who is made dependent upon the will of the Lord, set to work as a laborer according to the directives of the unchecked force, who remains free. Hegel was truthful also when he narrated the tale of the Lord's eventual dependence on the bondsman and the bondsman's development of a sense of independence within the peace of this primordial aristocratic state. For the laborer's activity gives him a mastery over nature. Hegel's dialectic does not concern us, however, only his supposition that the outcome of the death struggle between two unequal forces establishes a new relation of command and obedience. This brings the conceptions of both freedom and bondage into consciousness. This assumes, of course, that the weaker force yields, and through its self-preservative impulse subjects itself to slavery. In the state of war, there are many weaker forces who are overcome and killed, and thus die free, but still die. Nietzsche's own psychological historical myths are of the greatest importance. Wherever there is an overwhelming advantage of one force over the other, wherever there is the greatest variance between the power of the stronger force over the weaker, the disputation between forces is decided immediately and automatically. But the tighter the difference between the strength of forces, the closer one proceeds toward an equal contest, the greater the necessity for the contesting parties to impose a regulation upon themselves. Here we find the impetus for treaties, pacts, and intermarriages. Here, out of a recognition for the equal capacity for the enemy to do violence, we find the possibility for mutual respect. This is what Nietzsche called the origin of justice. Quote, origin of justice. Justice has its origin where there are parties of approximately equal strength, as Thucydides in the terrifying conferences of the Athenian and Melian envoys has rightly conceived. Thus, where there exists no demonstrable supremacy, and a struggle leads but to mutual useless damage, the realization arises that an understanding would best be arrived at, and some compromise entered into. The reciprocal is here the origin of justice. Each party contents the other inasmuch as each receives what it prizes more highly than the other. Each surrenders to the other what the other wants, and receives in return its own desire. Justice is therefore reprisal and exchange upon the basis of an approximate equality of power. Thus, revenge pertains originally to the domain of justice, as it is a sort of reciprocity. Equally so, gratitude. Justice reverts naturally to the standpoint of self-preservation, therefore to the egoism of this consideration. Why should I injure myself to no purpose, and perhaps never attain my end? So much for the origin of justice. Only because men, through mental habits, have forgotten the original motive of so-called just and rational acts, and also because for thousands of years children have been brought to admire and imitate such acts, have they gradually assumed the appearance of being unegotistical. End quote. Human All Too Human, 92. Quote, concerning the law of the weaker, whenever any party, for instance a besieged city, yields to a stronger party under stipulated conditions, the counter-stipulation is that there be a reduction to insignificance, a burning and destruction of the city, and thus a great damage inflicted upon the stronger party. Thus arises a sort of equalization principle upon the basis of which a law can be established. The enemy has an advantage to gain by its maintenance. To this extent, there is also a law between slaves and masters, limited only by the extent to which the slave may be useful to his master. The law goes originally only so far as the one party may appear to the other potent, invincible, stable, and the like. To such an extent, then, the weaker has rights, but very limited ones. Hence the famous dictum that each has as much law on his side as his power extends, or more accurately, as his power is believed to extend. End quote. Human All Too Human, 93. As Thrasymachus once argued, this is the true origin of the state. It establishes power relations because it is created by the confederation of contesting and usually unequal forces, brought together into a unity of domination. Thus we have an image of this new state of affairs, the political state, as a body bound together by a magic circle in which a limited number commands and the majority are made to obey, just as the instrumentalized, enslaved human beings are usually given some small share of rights to accord with their perceived level of power or usefulness, so too are the rulers given some small share of obligations that subjects them to the regulative power of the collective. As such, all political men become impulsively checked and regulated, and all political men experience freedom in the sense of a newfound assurance of their self-preservation, though to starkly unequal degrees, in which they can live and act without having to constantly defend themselves against others. The slave submits to becoming regulated because he is forced to at the point of the sword. The master accedes to it because the responsibilities and moral regulations imposed upon him are a small price to pay for the peace created by the state, which after all rules for his benefit. If it has not already become clear, war and peace must be understood to signify not only states of affairs, but, as Hobbes calls them, conditions. Hobbes describes war as a period of time in which man must adopt a certain disposition or a tendency in thought and action. The state of war is a state of mind, just as the state of peace. The latter is an essentially animal experience of the world, in which mortal fear is a regular and repeated feeling. The repetition of such an inner state would quickly become intolerable for an intelligent animal like man. But without the means of the political state, a powerful regulative body into which multiple individuals are incorporated, he would be unable to trust in his fellow human beings in roughly the same way as a man who attempts to draw up a peace treaty with a bear. The other condition, the state of mind of the man in peace, is removed to whatever extent possible from the repetition of the state of mortal fear, and without the constant anxiety of the looming death struggle, he is able to develop his capacity for trust, for respect, and for justice. This is the point at which politics and morality become widely practicable. How does the regulative regime carry out its work? There is no better account than that given by Nietzsche in his genealogy. In order for man to become trustworthy, he must be able to give promises, make oaths. In order for man to be able to give a promise, he must be held accountable for his actions. In order to become accountable for his actions, man must develop a memory so that he can recall his promises. The human animal will not obey the rules unless the memory of the collective's capacity for violence can be called forth with ease in order to intercept the free discharge of his otherwise chaotic impulses. How can such a thing be accomplished? By public violence. With the instruments of torture and the threat of death, the power of the political body becomes impressed in the mind of the individual. Thus, we paid for the creation of the civilized man with uncountable liters of blood, but this was the only way to cause impulse to yield to thought, for in nature every impulse seeks to gratify itself immediately. The community thus appropriates the thought of fear for itself. This is the trusty crook in the hand of the shepherd that yanks the animal back from its wayward course, such that eventually no physical violence necessarily has to be utilized to maintain peace. It is enough to brandish the crook. This is how the primitive human being becomes the political animal. But it would be a mistake to imagine that this represents a transition from a solitary existence to a communal one. The chief anachronism of Hobbes' vision of primitive man is the explicitly solitary nature of human life in the state of war, as he conveys it to us. All of the social contract theorists seem to capitulate to this error. But this should not trouble us very much, as they only give us myths and images, which are meant to be generally true, but are always untrue at the level of specifics. At least in Rousseau's case, the reasons for this blind spot are obvious enough. He imagines that man in his natural state would simply procreate and then leave the offspring to develop on their own after a short while. This narrative absolves Rousseau of his own guilt for abandoning his children to die. Philosophers are quite comical, are they not? But I digress. It would seem obvious enough that some sort of familial structure would form the most primordial of states. Human beings do not simply spring into being out of the ether as individuals, quote-unquote, but are raised as the offspring of parents, who also regulate the behavior of their offspring. So too would the state not simply spring into being at any specific historical moment, but would steadily develop in tandem with mankind's intelligence, and thus his capacity to organize greater and greater structures for the purpose of carrying out cooperative violence, driven by a heightened distress at his natural condition of war as that intelligence develops. We need not see the state as essentially modeled after the family structure, nor reify any particular family structure as the norm, but only to recognize the identity of both state and family as bodies with a regulative function in which war is obviated and cooperative force is directed according to the commands of a limited number. The latter proposition has always been the case in both families and states, ever since the social innovation of the division of labor. It seems almost certainly the case that the bella omnium contra omnis was never between individuals, quote-unquote, but always between collective bodies. Perhaps the family was the singular primordial form of such a body, perhaps more sophisticated, religious, and proto-political forms developed in tandem with the family from the very beginning. In the case of Greece, Fustel de Coulanges theorized a long process of confederation, first between families, then between small clans, and finally between larger tribes. The polis is the outcome of this confederating movement, which takes place over long generations and requires new religious oaths at every level of integration. Each movement forms a new body. The tribe is one of many sub-bodies of the city, the clan is one of many sub-bodies of the tribe, and so on. Between the members of each respective body and sub-body, force is constrained and harnessed, and peace is established. Thus, however it happened, the great social transformation that takes place in the development of politics is the movement from familial bodies to supra-familial bodies. Once again, it must be said that the reality of this process is almost certainly more complicated than such a simple statement may suggest. Perhaps there was always a spectrum of political commitment from the familial to the supra-familial. Nevertheless, it would seem undeniable that before the advent of large and complex states that organize cooperation between multiple, unrelated, and potentially competitive familial groups, which did not always exist and had to come into being, the family would represent the strongest unchecked force of organization. After these large and complex states arise, the supra-familial structures become far more powerful. Everything we need to know about this transformation of human social life is contained in the Oresteia of Aeschylus. This peerless dramatic tragedy is Aeschylus's meditation on justice. The word is used more often in this work than in any other extant tragedies. Justice, dike, must be understood in this context as right. One behaves justly when he acts in accord with his rights, such as when he pays another his rightful due, or takes what is rightly owed. This is analogous to the justice of Vergilt, which was the law of the Teutons, in which revenge becomes a fungible quantity, and every slight against another was a slight against his entire family, who would therefore be obligated to repay such a slight in kind. Quote, "A curse burns bright on crime. The father's crimes will blossom burst into the sons." End quote. Even in the most ancient societies, one could accept a monetary tribute as a compensation, or demand the life of an offending party. Following these anthropological insights, some economists have even theorized that the existence of money predates the existence of markets, that currency was created not to facilitate the exchange of goods, but originally to facilitate the payment of blood debts. But all blood had to be repaid in some fashion or other, or else the mutual respect of both parties, based on the belief that both have a roughly equal capacity for collective violence, would collapse, and the families would again enter the state of war. When a man exceeds his right, he acts unjustly. We can conceive of this view of justice with the image of balanced scales. When injustice occurs, things can only be made even once again by balancing the books, settling the blood debt that has been accrued. Thus, the familial form of the state body sanctified the act of revenge as just. They insisted on the equality of justice and revenge, just as zealously as we insist on a distinction between them. The Aeschylean tragedy calls forth an ancestral memory of the kind of political life that the archaic Greek must have known long before the founding of the polis. The chorus invokes the Furies, the ancient chthonic deities of Hellas, who preceded the existence of the Olympians, born from the blood of Uranus's castration, and thus tying the origin of these spirits of revenge to an act of violence and mutilation against one's own family. Such an act was the cardinal sin of the familial state body. When one spills the blood of a family member, he also spills his own blood. The family line of the Atridae, the royal family that is the subject of the Oresteia, is cursed with such sins. The supreme form of injustice prior to the suprafamilial state, murder, mutilation, and cannibalism carried out against one's own blood. Clytemnestra assassinates her husband Agamemnon in revenge for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. Her accomplice, Aegisthus, is Agamemnon's cousin, whose father was betrayed and killed by Agamemnon's father. In turn, Clytemnestra is butchered by her son Orestes in revenge for his father's assassination. For having murdered his own mother, Orestes is tormented by the Furies, who are the personification of the unthinking and resolute laws of blood that governed ancient times. Violence begets violence in an unending cycle. This is the Oresteia's critique of this ancient law of blood. The scales never become fully rebalanced, for each new act of revenge rends hearts with grief and inspires new injustices. The inclination of warring forces is never to return to parity, but to exceed the opposing party and thus to make them regret ever having exceeded their right. Quote, "Ancient violence longs to breed." End quote. This is the quagmire of the state of war, which is not solved by the familial state and its code of Wehrgilt. Contesting forces, in absentia of a regulative power to check their violence, never seek equality, but domination or extermination. Thus, the chain of revenge can never resolve itself according to its own logic. The brilliance of the Oresteia is in its portrayal of the suprafamilial state as the overcoming of this old form of justice, rather than a further development upon it. In practical terms, familial loyalty cannot continue to operate unchecked within the suprafamilial state, even if the stakes are not bloody rivalries and assassinations. All sub-bodies must be made obedient to the needs of the supra-body. Biologists have long been mistaken on this key point. Dawkins and his followers, for example, have suggested that the cooperation between unrelated individuals is simply a misplaced instinct for familial cooperation, which he accounts for through the workings of selfish genes that only care to preserve those organisms who share their genetics. Thus, the aphorism of tribal cultures, me and my brother against my cousins, me and my cousins against my tribe, me and my tribe against the world. The more genetically similar two individuals are, the more identical genes that they share, the more highly they will value the survival of one another and thus strive with one another and against others to ensure that survival. In Dawkins' view, the application of such value to unrelated individuals, the care for their condition and survival, is nothing more than a beautiful mistake. In this conception, our genes must be very stupid indeed to commit such a ridiculous misapprehension as to identify themselves with a religion or an empire or a nation. Any mutual association beyond the bounds of one's genetics would be an error of interpretation on the part of the organism. On the contrary, is it not obvious that the logic of suprafamilial states is antithetical to genetic loyalty and even hostile to it? Everywhere that genetic loyalty prevails within the suprafamilial state, the common morality, the new conception of decay that makes such a supra-association possible, fails in its regulative task. Once the familial state is confederated, and thus subordinated to the suprafamilial body, genetic loyalty represents corruption. If one follows the old law, he will defraud, cheat, and steal from other tribes or clans whenever the opportunity arises. If he holds the power to appoint offices or award honors, nepotism will triumph over merit and competence. He will ignore the laws that remand the right of violence into the exclusive care of the sovereign, and the law of blood will break the condition of peace established by the state. The cooperation that is made possible by political life becomes impossible. Distrust will reign in all men's dealings with one another, just as it did in the state of war. Thus, the Oresteia concludes with the Furies submitting to the wisdom of Athena. They agree to subordinate their law of blood to the civic law of the polis. If the old justice were not overcome, then the new justice would not be possible. The birth of this new justice is dramatized in mythological form as the first jury trial of Athens. Consider what a remarkable demand is made of the citizens of the polis in this development. The right to decide the punishment, and indeed whether one is punished at all, is taken from the family and the clan and given to the suprafamilial body. In accepting this state of affairs, one must allow for the possibility that he be compelled to abide by a ruling that is genetically disadvantageous. One must now hold the good of the polis above the good of the family. The justice demanded by the new law is precisely the injustice of the old law, which is why the Furies rage against this development until they are, almost miraculously, calmed by the words of Athena. The reversal is so striking that Aeschylus can only account for it by divine intercession. The power of the Furies is then integrated into a superordinate body that denies their moral logic. To the extent that this logic is allowed to persist, it is neutered of its rights to physical violence and is directed into the limited channels that the suprafamilial structure considers benign. Nevertheless, the Chorus of Furies proclaims the ascendance of this new law and seems to celebrate it. Quote, "The brutal strife, the civil war devouring men, I pray that it never rages through our city. Know that the good Greek never drinks the blood of Greeks, shed in an orgy of reprisal, life for life. That fury, like a beast, will never rampage through the land. Give joy in return for joy. One common will for love and hate, with one strong heart. Such a union heals 1,000 ills of man." End quote. Given that the Furies are the embodiment of the inflexible old law, this recognition on their part is nothing less than a magical transformation. Perhaps this surprising turn of events can be explained according to the logic of our analysis thus far. Because of the inability of the old law to put an end to the brutal strife of civil war, the bounty reaped by those who submitted to the new law was immeasurable and effected a complete inversion of the meaning of justice as it had been understood hitherto. In this new chapter of man's political life, the constituents of the suprafamilial body love and hate with a single will. The Furies recognize the good that this provides man in delivering him from the state of war. The phenomenon of political life has been unveiled. Becoming political is the subordination of bodies to greater and greater confederations, with the aim of delivering man as fully as possible from war to peace, wherein mankind can develop itself beyond the animals because it is no longer subjected to the regime of nature. This is the good that politics aims to fulfill. Of course, many have conceived of politics as a form of war by other means, just as economics. But if one is to employ other means than war in order to conduct war, then we must conclude that there are at least two different types of warfare: war, open physical conflict, and peace war, sublimated competition in which physical conflict is banned. Perhaps it would be best to leave such absurd categorization schemata behind and simply acknowledge that war by other means is better defined by those other means. To call it war, while it may be a helpful metaphorical flourish that is by no means lacking in insight about human nature, is to deny that anything significant has changed with the development of the political. What would necessarily follow from this is the denial that man is in any substantive way different from the animals. To call mankind the political animal would become farcical and meaningless. If war does not cease at the boundaries of the state, then man is no more a political animal than the ants, bees, lions, or buffalo. This is not to be understood as a rebuke to the likes of Heraclitus, who tells us quite correctly, quote, "War is the father of all, and the king of all. He renders some gods, others men. He makes some slaves, others free." End quote. As we have seen, the unequal distribution of rights and duties between sovereigns and slaves is determined at the outset of the political body by warfare in the most straightforward sense of the term. The way in which war is the father of freedom or bondage within the state is quite literal. According to the relative strength and weakness of the contesting forces who are integrated into a single body with the creation of the state, some are determined to be free, the lord, and others are regulated, directed, and made to labor, the bondsman. It would thus be foolish to suggest that the contestation between unequal forces in some way ceases upon the entry to political life. It would be equally foolish to say that this contestation ought to be called war when political life requires the establishment of peace. To deny this would be to deny the regulative function of the state. If the bella omnium contra omnes proceeded unchanged from the state of war, then the political state would be a meaningless and impotent development in human life. If we recognize that the state effects a sublimation of drive, we are required to acknowledge that a change has occurred. Whereas before, force could freely move in any direction, that is, physical violence could be used to gratify impulse for as far as it can push without being stopped. Under the state, force is constrained and must move only via the sanctioned channels. It also goes without saying that while a political body constrains the movement of forces affected by subbodies, such that they do not exercise violence against one another, it achieves this unity by turning the force outwards against all those political bodies external to it. We have already considered, however, that any law which constrains two political bodies and regulates their actions will subordinate them both to a common overarching body, creating a new unity of domination, or in some cases, a unity of relative equality, which may be more congenial to both sides, but is always tenser and more dangerous. As such, even a peace treaty between two distinct nations creates at least a rudimentary political association between them and represents at least an attempt to remove the respective parties from a relation of war, though not to the same degree as they would be were they merged into a single state. This model of the political, therefore, in no way seeks to deny the persistent reality of what is usually termed geopolitics. It is by no means an original observation that, in the relations between states with conflicting interests and no shared identity, the same patterns that govern the state of nature seem to obtain here, such that the geopolitical world is always, quote-unquote, Hobbesian. But this is to say no more than that geopolitics is a synonym for war, and politics, as we have described it so far, is a synonym for peace. As always, it is the task of the philosopher to sift through the dust and confusion of language, and here as elsewhere we find that these terms, politics and geopolitics, which appear as though they are different variations on the same idea, are actually refutations of one another. Politics never occurs between enemies, only between friends. Man is only the political animal when he sublimates and overcomes the activity of war. When that is no longer possible, and he picks up his sword or his gun or his flamethrower, he ceases to be political and becomes once again simply an animal. 2. Anti-Schmitt. At the beginning of Carl Schmitt's essay, The Concept of the Political, the truth is turned on her head. Quote, the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political, end quote. He then defines the concept of the political, quote, the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy, end quote. On the contrary, the concept of the political presupposes the concept of the state. This has been demonstrated adequately enough in the preceding section. Politics does refer to an antagonism, it is true, but only when this contest is constrained by the power of the state such that it occurs in peace. For Schmitt's concept of the political to attain intelligibility, his understanding of politics becomes synonymous with war, because his concept of the political precedes the state. Schmitt's conceptual reversal effectively denies any meaningful distinction between politics and geopolitics, and thus corrupts the meaning of the term state. The Schmittian state is, qualitatively speaking, indistinguishable from anarchy. The anarchistic view of statecraft serves as a pretext for an interpretation of political life that refuses any ethical telos for the state and interprets all political activity as indistinguishable from warfare. If we agree with Schmitt on these points, then we would have to believe that the Americans fighting a life-and-death struggle against the Germans at Normandy are engaged in the same activity as the Democrats and Republicans, debating in Congress. Any distinction between these two situations is, in the Schmittian conception, merely a matter of degrees. Normandy Beach is the more extreme manifestation of friend-enemy antagonisticity. Congress is a less extreme manifestation. Before we proceed further, the word antagonisticity is, I believe, a more honest rendering of Gegensätzlichkeit than antagonism. The word for antagonism is Gegensatz. This is antagonism in the sense of a concrete instance of antagonism. To be antagonistic is to be gegensätzlich. This is the adjective form of that noun. And so Gegensätzlichkeit is not just antagonism again, it is the nounized form of the adjective. It is antagonisticity, or if you like, we can substitute the term opposition to translate antagonism, in which case the same sequence would be opposition, oppositional, and oppositionalness. I must thank my friend Quinn Williams for informing me of this decisive detail in Schmitt's work, for it reveals a Platonization, the assertion of an abstracted quality as a governing force over the real, which we might define here as the capacity for antagonism. Furthermore, rendering the term as antagonisticity serves another purpose. It is important to perceive the linguistic ugliness of Schmitt's conceptual schema. For Schmitt, the enemy is defined as the public enemy. Schmitt appeals to the Roman concept of the hostis in defining the public enemy. While his purpose is to define the political enemy as distinct from the private adversary, he invokes the term that the Romans would have used for both enemies and foreigners. Originally to them, all foreign peoples were hostile foreign peoples. Again, this represents an importation of the state of war into the state of peace. As we have already considered, the state emerges from war and often reifies an unequal distribution of power and status determined by war. In this sense, politics is founded on war. Therefore, if we define politics as the state, as I have done, and war as politics, as Schmitt has done, then Schmitt's starting premise looks sensible. But this would be too charitable, for it is not his meaning to suggest that the political life, quote-unquote, presupposes war merely as a prior establishing event. Rather, his argument proceeds by equivocating antagonisticity in the state of peace with the antagonisticity of the state of war. Here, his Platonization of the concept discloses the false equivocation of what the potential for antagonism represents within states versus what it represents outside of the state. For Schmitt, the state's sovereignty lies in its power to determine the friend from the enemy and to determine exceptions to that rule. Once again, it must be said that on a geopolitical scale, this is true. If international relations operate within the state of nature, then the political life within the peace created within these respective national entities could be said to, quote-unquote, presuppose the Schmittian concept of the political, insofar as we have understood Schmitt's concept of the political as essentially war, and insofar as we have reduced politics to geopolitics. No sensible person could disagree with Schmitt were this his point. But because he has interpreted the friend-enemy antagonisticity into a generalized understanding of all antagonisticity, Schmitt cannot consistently hold such a view. He cannot mean to tell us that political life within peace is only possible because of the state's power and willingness to defend itself in geopolitical power struggles, because for Schmitt, the character of political life within peace is qualitatively the same as it is in war. Whatever the political activity within the state looks like, it is only an interaction characterized by the same friend-enemy activity that precedes the state. Quote, to the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. All peripherals must be left aside from this term, including military details and the development of weapons technology. War is armed combat between organized political entities. Civil war is armed combat within an organized unit. A self-laceration endangers the survival of the latter. The essence of a weapon is that it is a means of physically killing human beings. Just as the term enemy, the word combat, too, is to be understood in its original existential sense. It does not mean competition, nor does it mean pure intellectual controversy, nor symbolic wrestlings in which, after all, every human being is somehow always involved. For it is a fact that the entire life of a human being is a struggle, and every human being symbolically a combatant. The friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. It is the most extreme consequence of enmity. It does not have to be common, normal, something ideal, or desirable, but it must nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. End quote. Schmitt, Concept of the Political 3. Schmitt makes it painfully obvious for us in this passage that his concept of the political must be understood as a denial of the significance of the state. Civil war is therefore a, quote, self-laceration. He does not need to suggest that civil war collapses the state, nor implies a fracture, nor the formation of new ones. Whether it is a war between individuals living under one state or a war between individuals from 2 or 100 states, the same dynamic obtains in all cases. Friend-enemy antagonisticity is simply a human universal. It occurs whether the state exists or not. Schmitt does not provide an argument in favor of this assertion. It is treated as axiomatic, as an a priori understanding of political affairs. As a consequence of this equivocation, quote, the real possibility of physical killing underlies all antagonisticity with no regard to circumstances. To the extent that Schmitt acknowledges any difference at all between mankind in the state of war or the state of peace, he posits only a difference of quantity. Any antagonism becomes a political antagonism if the antagonism takes on the character of the friend-enemy distinction. Quote, the political is the most intense and extreme antagonisticity, and every concrete antagonisticity becomes that much more political the closer it approaches the most extreme point, that of the friend-enemy grouping. End quote. In my own conception of the political, any form of antagonism that became so extreme as to result in physical killing would represent a rupture of the state and a return to war. For Schmitt, it is simply a self-laceration. Further, Schmitt argues that the political is not synonymous with moral antagonisticity, religious antagonisticity, etc., but could manifest in any of them, and will. And, importantly, he gives a sense of what he means by the friend-enemy distinction by articulating a dualistic theory of, quote, final distinctions in every, quote, relatively independent endeavor of human thought and action, end quote. Quote, in contrast to the various relatively independent endeavors of human thought and action, particularly the moral, aesthetic, and economic, the political has its own criteria which express themselves in a characteristic way. The political must therefore rest on its own ultimate distinctions, to which all action with a specifically political meaning can be traced. Let us assume that in the realm of morality the final distinctions are between good and evil, in aesthetics between beautiful and ugly, in economics profitable and unprofitable. The question then is whether there is also a special distinction which can serve as a simple criterion of the political and of what it consists. The nature of such a political distinction is surely different from that of those others. It is independent of them and as such can speak clearly for itself. End quote. Schmitt, Concept of the Political 2. This is a critical maneuver for Schmitt, because his argument hinges on the separation of the political and the ethical. Certainly, this is not his only concern. For instance, he also separates the political from the economic, which would represent a rejection of the fundamental logic of Marxism, though this needn't concern us further. Perhaps this is why Schmitt, quote, never engaged in a full-fledged confrontation with Nietzsche, end quote, Tracy B. Strong citing Heinrich Meyer. The attempt to somehow extract and isolate the political from the moral could only have appeared to Nietzsche as a subtle trick of language, immediately raising the question of what it was that Schmitt was attempting to obscure. Valuations, quote, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life, end quote, underlie both the ethical and the political. Thus, the questions of politics are at bottom questions of valuations. This refers us back to morality. My contention is that Schmitt's aim is to portray politics and the state as non-moral, but even in his portrayal of politics as a distinction or an antagonisticity forces us back into the moral world of values. All such motivating distinctions or hostile antagonisms require an evaluative judgment about worth, goodness, utility, or preferability. All such distinctions are the work of interpretation. The drives interpret, determine value, and judge according to their own criteria. There are therefore no original friends, nor original enemies. In other words, whether one is friend or foe is not a matter of fact, but requires interpretation. Even a strictly biological valuation, e.g. the friend purely as kin group, is still an interpretation of the worth of biological kinship as outranking all other things of worth. The master morality is still a morality. The persuasive power of the argument, however, is in Schmitt's elaboration on this separation of the political and the ethical, with the assertion that the enemy need not be considered evil, nor aesthetically ugly, nor as an economic adversary. Rhetorically, Schmitt appears as the mature and nuanced thinker, carefully pointing out to his reader that we may still acknowledge the virtues of our enemies, even as the hard realities of political antagonism force us into conflict. But if we draw upon our own experience, as well as on the historical record, and reflect on this proposition, even if only for the briefest of moments, we will have to conclude that Schmitt's argument is purely idealist. It may seem logically plausible, but it's distant from reality. The political enemy, or hostis, public enemy in Schmitt's sense, or hostile foreigner in the Roman sense, is the member of an opposed fighting collective with whom one struggles for their very existence, their very way of life. In every such conflict, the enemy is not just considered a political adversary, but also evil. And for that matter, usually they are portrayed as ugly, to which any study of wartime propaganda will attest. Schmitt admits this. Quote, emotionally, the enemy is easily treated as being evil and ugly because every distinction, most of all the political, as the strongest and most intense of the distinctions and categorizations, draws upon other distinctions for support. End quote. But then he claims without argument, quote, this does not alter the autonomy of such distinctions. End quote. Why not? The fact that all of these apparently autonomous forms of thinking are always interrelated with one another, and that we can scarcely think of a political conflict in which they were not interrelated, might give a sober mind pause before making such an assertion. But we needn't rely simply on inductive arguments in this respect. The very fact that the enemy fights for a mutually exclusive moral valuation necessitates that he is evil in the eyes of his enemy. I would even go so far as to suggest that this is true by definition. The attempt to separate the political from the ethical fails on this basis. Even the dualistic framework for understanding these, quote, relatively independent endeavors of human thought, end quote, is something of a sleight of hand. The distinction between beauty and ugliness in aesthetics does not in any wise resemble the friend-enemy distinction. The disputes in aesthetics are not usually over what is to be termed beautiful or not, even if there are some disputes around the edges or concerning the nuances of the definition. If this was the sole focus of aesthetics, it would be a rather prosaic and facile subdiscipline of philosophy, logical arguments mounted in the defense of differing tastes. Rather, aesthetic philosophy goes way beyond such disputes. It consists of disputes about beauty's essential qualities, or how it is that we know what is beautiful, or distinctions between artistic and natural beauty. This is to say nothing of philosophers who also include a conception of the sublime, Schopenhauer, or those with theories of aesthetics that don't involve beauty at all, Nietzsche, Tolstoy. Further, to suggest that anything meaningful has been said by raising the distinction of profitable and unprofitable would betray a fool's understanding of economics. There is no real dispute among economists as to what constitutes the profitable. It is difficult to imagine a debate between two economists with diametrically opposed theories of what profit means. Instead, the economists attempt to comprehend and predict patterns in markets as populations make trades and other economic choices. This understanding may benefit one who seeks to make a profit, but macroeconomic analysis in particular is not really concerned with individual profits. Schmitt's generalization about these dualistic distinctions in human thought is little more than a creative gloss. To the extent that he is correct, his position is not interesting, for these distinctions do little more than to define the territory of an endeavor in the most general terms. And to the extent that his position is interesting, it is not correct. In none of these endeavors do the practitioners attempt to reduce their activity to these basic distinctions, as Schmitt attempts to do with politics. And it hardly even needs to be said that these endeavors, in fact, cannot be conceived as, quote, independent, not even relatively independent. Changing aesthetic sensibilities drive economic trends. Moral crusades manifest as political campaigns. Political decisions affect the economy. The interrelatedness of these relatively independent endeavors cannot be hand-waved away. As it happens, the only endeavor whose type of distinction actually resembles Schmitt's conception of the political is morality. The political antagonist defines his friend as good and his enemy as evil. The moral antagonist defines the good man as a friend and the evil man as an enemy. These two operations of thought and mutually exclusive categories that they reify are exchangeable with one another, and thus Schmitt has no solid foundation on which to distinguish them. But Schmitt lists morality alongside other intellectual endeavors as another relatively independent domain. Why? Perhaps so that the obvious homonymy of the political and moral forms of distinction will appear innocuous and not pose a problem for his argument, which fundamentally requires a clean separation between them. But here he has equalized the unequal. Schmitt must deny the connection of the political to the ethical. If it is not denied, then Schmitt's argument collapses into a kind of self-conscious moralism. Thus, Schmitt has little more to tell us than to reiterate what Nietzsche has already said, that human beings struggle with one another on the basis of contrasting valuations. But in what way does he further our understanding beyond this? In fact, no further elaboration is possible. The friend-enemy distinction is intractable. Because the good-evil distinction is indistinguishable from it, it too becomes intractable. As such, a Nietzschean self-overcoming of morality would be unintelligible for Schmitt. One could as little think beyond good and evil as they could engage in politics beyond friend and enemy. From this standpoint, none of the political questions that occur specifically within the state and between friends are in any way further elucidated or even addressed. There is nothing to be learned from Schmitt about maintaining social trust, achieving consensus, or fostering the good of the polity. A reader who takes Schmitt's precepts to heart will close the pages of his works with only a heightened interest in identifying his enemies and a renewed resolve to employ physical violence against them if necessary. In other words, the effect of Schmitt's work is to put the civilized man back into the mindset of war. If one wishes to understand why Schmitt would want to further such a mindset, we need only look to Schmitt's own words and apply his ideas to his own work. Quote, "All political concepts, images, and terms have a polemical meaning. They are focused on a specific conflict and are bound to a concrete situation. The result, which manifests itself in war or revolution, is a friend-enemy grouping, and they turn into empty and ghost-like abstractions when this situation disappears." End quote. Schmitt, Concept of the Political 3. Schmitt's own concept of the political must therefore be included with all political concepts. He is telling us that his own work has a polemical meaning, proper to a specific conflict, and bound to his own concrete situation. Before we proceed, then, we must ask, what was that situation? Schmitt wrote during the crisis of the Weimar Republic. German society was plagued by economic instability, and the political system had become the battleground for competing private interests, meaning that the state was no longer the decisive sovereign. Quote, "The classical profile of the state was shattered as its monopoly on politics waned." End quote. Tracy B. Strong. In Schmitt's time, the pretenses of neutrality that followed necessarily from Weimar's liberal democratic constitution allowed even those who supported anti-republican and totalitarian movements to compete for political power, so long as they operated within the bounds of the law. The Constitution therefore allowed for the participation of those who openly declared that their goal was to subvert the Constitution. Thus did the Weimar Republic fail to distinguish friend from enemy in a vain pursuit of neutral governance. Within such a context, it is easy enough to see the logic of Schmitt's polemic. He centers the friend-enemy distinction because he believed that the Weimar Republic's failure to recognize its enemies was its fundamental weakness. He opposes what he calls depoliticization and neutralization, and correlates these tendencies with liberalism, because these were the attitudes that represented that fundamental weakness. These attitudes are the manifestation of that weakness. By defining the state through the concept of the political, Schmitt was attempting an intervention by which the Weimar state could come to a recognition of this fundamental power on which its very existence is supported, the sovereign right to distinguish enemies from friends, and to marshal its authority to expel these enemies from public life, or even use violence to suppress them. And yet, Schmitt would become a member of the Nazi Party and a jurisprudential apologist for Hitler. It would seem that Schmitt's prediction was proven correct, that an authoritarian political movement would subvert the Constitution, and yet he finds himself among their ranks. What does this tell us about Schmitt's concept of the political? We may set aside questions of Schmitt's motives or his morality. If we rigorously apply Schmitt's own ideas to the rise of the Nazis, we would have to conclude that the Nazis understood the friend-enemy distinction, whereas the Weimar state did not. Even if Schmitt's work can be taken in so many words as a warning about the danger of the Nazis, or groups like them, its solely amoral analysis of politics does not provide a logic that can oppose Nazism, once it establishes itself as an ordering force in the polity. Schmitt would be the first one to tell us that it is only weak political entities who will be destroyed so long as the myth of neutrality is pursued. Those who still act according to the friend-enemy distinction, that is, those who are willing to wage physical warfare against their enemies, will survive and triumph. This has been the lesson that the Schmittians have taken, such that whatever his intentions may have been, Schmitt's work has served as an apologia for authoritarian subversions of the Constitution rather than as a bulwark against it. As such, some who have made use of Schmitt, such as Leo Strauss, have recognized that he does not provide a workable political theory so much as open up a critical line of inquiry as regards the viability of liberalism. For Strauss, the fundamental problem of liberalism is its inability to provide a compelling counter-narrative to the mythologies of communism and fascism. Liberalism must not fail to recognize that it is in an existential struggle with these competing narratives. It cannot operate according to the logic that within all human beings is a set of liberal sensibilities yearning to be liberated. Whether one wishes to strengthen liberalism or believes that liberalism ought to crumble, one may at least say that these concerns are rooted firmly in geopolitics, the struggles between competing valuations on an international scale. Why, then, have so many readers of Schmitt taken his work for a description of domestic political life, or even a prescription as to how one ought to think about opposing political factions? The simple answer is that there is nothing in Schmitt's work that prohibits this reading. In fact, his generalization of the friend-enemy antagonisticity into a universal and unchangeable truth of human political life would demand it. In comprehension of the fundamental errors of Schmitt's theory, we can attempt to understand the impetus behind Schmitt's historical narrative. Given in the 1929 lecture, The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations, he gives each of the past 5 centuries a definite character, a defining idea or spirit of the age. It would be easy enough to quibble with him on these points and bring up all of the nuances, complications, and gray areas, but such an approach would be simply to deny the man some poetic license in conveying his point, which would be unjust. Many writers have attempted to classify the typical spirits of the respective centuries, including Nietzsche, see The Will to Power, History of European Nihilism. I do not find anything terribly contentious about such schemata. Thus, we may grant Schmitt that the 16th century was dominated by theological conflict, prompting a 17th century transition to metaphysics. But of course, there are contentions in metaphysics just as there were in theology. In the 18th century, Europe moves on to a humanitarian and moralistic phase, the high noon of the Enlightenment. This gives way to the economic 19th century concerned with production and consumption. Finally, we arrive in Schmitt's own time, the 20th century, in which technology becomes the driving force. According to Schmitt, it was the violence and chaos of the religious wars that prompted a search for a, quote, neutral domain of thought. Each of these developments, or sublations, can be seen as another attempt at an escape from antagonisticity as it inevitably develops within a new discourse. Consider, for example, the metaphysical philosophers of the 1600s. This movement can be seen in microcosm in the life of Descartes, the inaugurator of Enlightenment philosophy. He grew up in a France riven by sectarian conflict, while he himself possessed a more universal and rational conception of the divine. We might also consider his contemporary Hobbes, whose Leviathan, another work which seeks for a strong sovereign state, is written in context of the English Civil War, which had seemed to return man to the state of nature. Leviathan is also a work of systematic metaphysics as well as a work of political theory. Thus, the 16th century seeks, quote, neutrality by shifting the dialogue from theological disputes to the metaphysical. Of course, the disputes resume again, but every subsequent century appears to Schmitt as a further step in the search for neutrality. Over the ages, the seeds of liberalism are planted and begin to germinate. With the dawn of the Enlightenment, the enemy is to be reimagined as the, quote, debating adversary. The real threat of physical violence is to be removed, and the conflict rarefied into an intellectual matter. Of course, given my own standpoint, I would counter Schmitt. The state, as the entity with a monopoly on violence, or Leviathan, has always attempted to remove the potential threat of physical violence from one subject to another. Again, Schmitt's narrative involves a blurring of any distinction between types of antagonisticity. We must remember that the French Catholics and the Huguenots were countrymen. Their wars of religion were civil wars, though religious wars occurred in many other polities. To the extent that the Leviathan succeeds in establishing a political body and installs a state of peace, its subjects become grouped by the state as friends. So long as that system is healthy and not, quote, self-lacerating, they will be, when they debate in their parliaments, debating adversaries. It would seem, then, that the strength of the state, which Schmitt's project seems to wish to foster, is precisely the thing that transmutes enemies into debating adversaries. A healthy state does not have violent factions of collectivities within itself who are willing to follow the dictates of their own friend-enemy hatreds rather than the sovereign laws of their country. To the extent that Schmitt is correct, once again it is only on the level of geopolitics, and not politics. It would be foolish to treat a hostile foreign nation as a debating adversary. But purer forms of enmity are the death of the polis should they arise from within. The same is true with the progression to the economic century and the transmutation of enemies into economic competitors. Presumably, all members of the domestic populace are, in fact, economic competitors. Market capitalism allows for no such thing as pure cooperation within the market. All compete with one another for the control of capital, even when they cooperate as part of this competition. Thus, it is not clear that the friend-enemy distinction maps onto the market. Nevertheless, if we take the economic competition as a, quote, neutralization of friend-enemy antagonism, then we must conclude that this is once again evidence that the state has acted successfully as the Leviathan. Again, Schmitt would be correct to suggest that foreign nations should not regard the nature of their competition with one another as purely economic. But that is so obvious that any head of state who read these words would hardly think it worth saying. Now, in the age of technicity, we imagine that technology can become the ultimate neutral domain. Indeed, there are many tech optimists and tech futurists who believe that scientific advancement and technological innovation will, of itself, improve the human condition. We can see, to Schmitt's credit, how each neutralization builds on the established premises of the former ones. If market forces represent a neutral power for managing human affairs, which is to say non-political, which is to say non-friend enemy, and can deliver us leisure time, abundance, health, prosperity, and convenience, can we not simply trust in the power of economic innovation and set politics aside? Indeed, Schmitt must be considered vindicated, at least regarding the increased prevalence and influence of such views. His critique can be summed up in his aphorism, quote, "Spirit struggles against spirit," end quote. Technology is, in fact, never a neutral force. In Nietzsche's language, it is always harnessed by valuations. The sword or the automatic rifle does not kill autonomously, but must be placed in the hand of a human being. On this point, Schmitt is in agreement with the likes of Adorno and Horkheimer, see Dialectic of Enlightenment, as well as Thulsa Doom, see Conan the Barbarian. Of course, there is an analogy here to the state, insofar as the state and its sovereign power can be seen as the sword, and the Schmittian political as the determination of value that swings the sword. This conception appears sensible until we pose the question of whether Schmitt has a viable understanding of valuations. He has already attempted to sever the political from the ethical and to understand the forces that seize control of the state entirely through the friend-enemy distinction. Perhaps Schmitt's most famous quote is found in his Theory of the Partisan, a commentary on the concept of the political. Quote, "Tell me who your enemy is, and I will tell you who you are." End quote. Friend-enemy antagonisticity is generative of everything in human life. By knowing one's enemy, one knows oneself. At this point, it becomes essential to raise the Nietzschean critique that Schmitt's sense of valuations is entirely reactive and outward-facing. Quote, "While every aristocratic morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of its own demands, the slave morality says no from the very outset to what is outside itself, different from itself, and not itself. And this no is its creative deed. This about-face of the valuing standpoint, this inevitable gravitation to the objective instead of back to the subjective, is typical of ressentiment. The slave morality requires, as the condition of its existence, an external and objective world. To employ physiological terminology, it requires objective stimuli to be capable of action at all. Its action is fundamentally a reaction." End quote. Nietzsche, Genealogy of Morals, Book 1, Section 10. The friend-enemy distinction operates according to the logic of slave morality, which makes its evaluations based on an outward glance to the enemy and defines itself by its opposition to the enemy. The existential fear for the destruction of one's way of life provides a reactive model for asserting one's self-identity and defining his political activity. As such, there is no sense in Schmitt that one might wish to wield the power of the state or technology for the sake of affirmative valuations, which do not take account of the enemy at all, but have for their focus an active conception of the good. There is simply no language within Schmitt that allows for this possibility. It would be unintelligible to his theory. As such, all grand visions for human political life are mere dreams and fantasies for Schmitt. A form of escapism, a refusal to see the hard truth of politics. The result of such thinking is a weakened, emaciated form of the state, a spiritless state that is now conceived as a neutral entity, a, quote, whipping post for business interests, unions, churches, all those domestic entities and factions who still maintain a degree of spirit, again conceived here as the capacity for friend-enemy antagonisticity, will take every advantage. It is no surprise to Schmitt that man should attempt to flee from conflict, even as man is the animal who lives eternally in conflict. War is obviously a source of grief, suffering, death. But what can Schmitt make of this push over long generations to find ever more, quote, neutral grounds for the basis of society and its values? It can only be a long course of degradation, the development of a long error. The comparison to Rousseau becomes illustrative here. For Rousseau, the development of civilization itself is a kind of error, in that the human lot is not improved by the foundation of the state, the advancements of the arts and sciences, and the creation of civic life. Nevertheless, Rousseau accounts for why it is that mankind insensibly escaped from this state of nature. Man naturally seeks pleasure and self-preservation, and these social developments are driven by this search. Thus, in both cases, we have a kind of error of social evolution which makes us worse off than we were before. For Schmitt, it is the development of neutrality and the rise of depoliticization. For Rousseau, it is civic society itself. However, in the case of Rousseau, for all his romanticism, we have an error that is committed insensibly. Something in the way of the solution to our modern alienation can be sought through the rational understanding of our sad state of affairs, and in that sense reason can serve as a corrective. While we may not be able to return to the state of nature, we can recognize the faults of civic life and attempt to correct them. For example, by developing political processes that honor the general will. From Schmitt's narrative, on the other hand, we'd have to conclude that reason is the culprit. Our intellectual endeavors have driven along this escapist fantasy of neutralization. There's nothing in the way of the solution other than to, again, recognize the intractability of the friend-enemy antagonisticity. Thus, our reactive instincts are inescapable, and prudence would dictate that we should therefore be willing to engage in real political conflict, which can only mean raising the possibility of physical violence against those we fear are destroying our way of life. Ironically, Schmitt's view is easier to romanticize as a tragic view of the human political condition than the view of Rousseau, the arch-romantic. But these positions have led Schmitt to a place of incoherence. Should it be the case that the state were perfectly strengthened in exactly the way Schmitt conceives, all friend-enemy distinctions within the polity would be neutralized. The fatal flaw within liberalism is in its inability to neutralize, and thus to let those who will practice friend-enemy thinking run roughshod over the state. Were liberalism to practice this antagonism, however, and defeat its enemies, all those who fight against liberalism, all those remaining within the polity would become friends, and the populace would become depoliticized. Certainly, Schmitt would argue that the friend-enemy antagonisticity will simply arise in a new form. But this is no more than to say that the state can never do anything perfectly. It can never put an end to all crime once and forever, but must continually marshal its energies to stop crime whenever it occurs. The same must be said of internal political dissension, especially if it has the capacity to rise to the level of friend-enemy antagonisticity. By Schmitt's own logic, we must conclude that the successful state, the healthy state, one which does not self-lacerate, is the state that succeeds in continually depoliticizing its population, making them unwilling to engage in physical violence against one another. The friend-enemy distinction can only be intelligibly viewed from this perspective as a continual problem that the state has to defeat. Therefore, Schmitt's goals of fostering a new affirmation of friend-enemy antagonisticity as an inescapable reality would make him an enemy of any strong liberal state who wished to maintain itself against those who wished to undermine its way of life. By analogy, he would be like someone who says that crime is inevitable, thus we must learn to embrace this reality and become more effective criminals ourselves, rather than continually marshal our energies to put a stop to it. It is an amusing argument on the part of Schmittians when they react to such statements as I have made, that Schmitt becomes the enemy of liberalism, as a kind of proof of Schmitt's argument. They say, in calling the purveyor of the friend-enemy theory your enemy, you have proved the theory. It is like arguing with a Hegelian. All those who attempt to negate Hegel place themselves into a dialectical relationship with Hegel, meaning they have affirmed Hegel. But this is a language game. Let us not argue definitions, but look to the effect of Schmitt's doctrines when implemented as a political theory. Schmitt's credibility is dismantled the moment one recognizes that his theory weakens the state whenever it takes hold in the minds of the populace. This is because the terms by which Schmitt denies the neutrality of the state have the effect of rendering our image of the state itself in the most neutral conceivable terms. It becomes merely a tool of power to be used by political antagonists. It becomes a technology, a weapon. The state can never be neutral for Schmitt because it is always wielded by those who are not neutral. It cannot make apolitical decisions because those decisions are actually made by the politicized collectivities of adversaries who vie for control over the state. But this conception means that the state has no positive content in itself. It becomes even more profoundly neutral in Schmitt's conception because life within the state has no value, no significance, represents no qualitative difference compared to life in the state of war. This returns us to the fundamental Schmittian error, the inversion of the relationship between the political and the state, and thus the profound meaninglessness of the state. Certainly, Schmitt would have argued that this was precisely the conception he wished to fight against. The most important aspect of Schmitt's historical narrative, in relation to the context in which he wrote, is that he viewed the period from the 16th century up to his own time as the, quote, epoch of the sovereign state. The geopolitical order was rooted in the notion of states as the, quote, sole subjects of politics. It was the era of the jus publicum Europaeum, the European public law established by the Peace of Westphalia. Under this geopolitical order, the sovereignty of individual states was equally recognized, and certain rules of warfare were observed. A number of recent developments had threatened this order, however. The, quote, infusion of militant ideology into politics, end quote, with the rise of Marxism and fascism. The rise of the total state, which no longer viewed international treaties as sacrosanct, but began to use them as mere tactical maneuvers. The increased brutality of warfare, now waged in the name of, quote-unquote, humanity, a conception which necessarily dehumanizes one's foes. By Schmitt's time, the diplomatic order between sovereign states had been existentially weakened. To him, it seemed as though the chief culprits were the political extremists, who needed to be driven from the open arena. However, if the sin of the Nazis before taking power is that they were contributing to the internal chaos and dissension as part of the pluralism tolerated by the impotent Weimar government, then after taking power and establishing the Third Reich, the pluralism is ended and a one-party total state established. The problem has been remedied. We must therefore notice that the context in which an authoritarian movement would meet with the greatest success is precisely within the pluralistic, liberal, democratic society, in which the capacity for the friend-enemy antagonisticity actually becomes heightened by the permissiveness of liberalism. It is almost impossible to conceive of the Nazis rising to power against a monarchical state with a firm grip on the levers of power and an intolerance for competing political visions. As such, many have utilized Schmitt's theories as a critique of democracy. I'm not sure what to make of the irony that those who have done so have typically been fascists themselves. If they really believed in their own theory, They would not attempt to create a consciousness of the friend-enemy distinction in the minds of the reigning liberal government, for this would lead to their own exclusion from the political arena. Thus, they are attempting to heighten this consciousness in the masses. It is not difficult to inspire reactive thought patterns in the populace at large. Another place in which Schmitt is correct. The friend-enemy distinction is a pervasive impulse in human thought that rightly describes how the masses typically think about politics. The communist or fascist agitator wishes to push this pre-existing reactive form of cognition to the extreme, such as to create the very pluralistic chaos that a careful reading of Schmitt would reveal to be the death of the state and the return to war. But as Schmitt has given them no language to understand the meaning of the state outside of its use as a weapon for friend-enemy antagonism, they have no reason to avoid such an outcome. As such, Schmitt unwittingly discloses the critical yet always obscured interdependence of democracy and fascism. Another reversal of the truth within his project is the claim that democracy produces depoliticization. In fact, democracy is probably the best political system for rapidly politicizing one's populace in the Schmittian sense. The logic of democracy regards the state as a tool of majorities for the purpose of achieving their interests, in opposition to competing groups. The party structures that develop out of this competition are only distinguished from warring tribes, in that they refrain from doing violence to one another in the streets. Instead, they vote. It is the conception of the state articulated in Starship Troopers. Quote, "When you vote, you are exercising political authority. You're using force. And force, my friends, is violence, the supreme authority from which all other authorities are derived." End quote. But why shouldn't democratic force be used to order the executions of one's political enemies, enslave the powerless, or expel the undesirables? One can only justify such prohibitions by appealing to Republican principles. But what would this represent other than a limitation on democratic power? The fascist recognizes no such limitations on the power of the state. Even if the fascist party installs a tyranny after it has come to power through the democratic process and puts an end to future democratic activity, the fascist remains the ultimate democrat. Democracy is the fascist's only reliable road to power, and he takes democratic power through to its logical conclusions. An ascendant political power operating according to Schmittian principles would be foolish not to use every means at its disposal to break the power of its competitors. Once one has acquired the power of the state, one must do everything possible to strengthen it. For democracy to remain democratic, then, it requires another set of foundational principles which circumscribe its powers. Democracy requires the limitation of democracy in order to continue to exist, or else it requires a population virtuous enough to understand politics in terms which transcend this barbaric worldview. I say barbaric because Schmitt's politics is a return to the state of nature. He has done what most philosophers have done throughout the ages, taken a popular prejudice and amplified it, sharpened it, made it more subtle, and laundered it into philosophical language. In the eras prior to democracy, what Schmitt calls the political, the friend-enemy distinction, was actively suppressed by aristocratic governments for precisely the reason that it is the first instinct of the masses. Every strong polity, whatever its political system, depoliticizes its subjects, again using that word in the Schmittian sense. Such a polity allows true politics to begin. Upon the declaration, "We are all friends here. There is no more need for mutual antagonism. Among ourselves, we are only debating adversaries, private enemies, or economic competitors. Our enemies lie beyond our borders." Some Schmittians will no doubt argue that much of Schmitt's argumentation hinges on this state of affairs as the ideal, and attempts to spark the recognition of the friend-enemy distinction on the level of geopolitics, which was precisely the level at which the friend-enemy distinction was being ignored in Schmitt's time. We might say that from Schmitt's perspective, it seemed that all the so-called sovereign states were failing to recognize friends and enemies, whereas the domestic populace was doing so feverishly between themselves. But Schmitt's approach cannot provide a solution. His theory confounds politics and geopolitics, and therefore we cannot say that we ought to practice politics one way and geopolitics another way. If we return to the conception of the state as a political body and consider the political realities as the outward manifestations of the physiological health or sickness of the society, then we have developed a language by which we can understand the true significance of Schmittian thinking. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols, The Four Great Errors, Section 2, quote, "The newspaper reader says, such and such a party, by committing such an error, will meet its death. My superior politics say, a party that can make such mistakes is in its last agony. It no longer possesses any certainty of instinct. Every mistake is in every sense the sequel to degeneration of the instincts, to disintegration of the will." End quote. Schmittian thinking, in other words, is not the cause of political disintegration, but its effect. To put it in Nietzsche's terminology, it is a symptom of decline. Friend-enemy antagonism only thrives where the people are immiserated, where law and order fails, where corruption reigns in the halls of government. This was precisely the situation in Schmitt's own time. When failing governments embrace a war footing and attempt to more vigorously punish their enemies with state violence, and seek to reward friends and allies through cronyism, it only hastens this decline and further undermines their credibility. Schmittians thrive during times of chaos. This is their natural habitat, and we may know everything there is to know about them from this symptomatology. Schmitt worried about depoliticization, but it is the Schmittian who makes true politics impossible to practice. Once the Schmittians arrive, your politics is already in a state of dysfunction. Thus, for anyone who has an interest in the political life, the Schmittian must be seen as a symptom and not an enemy. Should he ever become an enemy in the Schmittian sense, this event will demarcate the end of political life and the eruption of physical violence. Certainly, this may be necessary at times, or even inevitable. The truly political man, however, whom Schmitt calls depoliticized, does not pursue his goals as a reaction to competing collectivities, but with the understanding of the political as an extension of the ethical, with the aim of seeking his understanding of the good. Viewed from this perspective, the dogmatism of Schmitt reveals itself. In every instance, what he says about politics on the domestic level is a corruption of politics that will heighten internal pluralism and threaten the state. When his assertions are applied to geopolitics, they are uninsightful truisms that have been known since the time of Thucydides. As Schmitt himself has told us, his concepts are polemical, the product of certain circumstances. The friend-enemy distinction and his fears of depoliticization ought to appear to us now as, quote, empty and ghost-like abstractions, end quote, springing from a bygone historical context. Schmitt no longer holds any meaning for us today, except as a confession of the pathologies of democracy, which may provide a useful psychological guide. When one has affirmative political goals, rooted in a conception of the good, there are 1,000 different ways to deal with enemies that do not involve punishment, physical violence, or any kind of warfare. There is a saying commonly attributed to Abraham Lincoln, though the attribution is dubious, quote, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" End quote. The possibility of resolving the antagonism by creating a new body of friendship is denied by the Schmittian. But on what basis? It is simply an axiom for a person of this decadent psychology. Antagonism must continue. He does not feel he even has to justify this statement. After all, he makes his appeals to the masses, who act based on feelings rather than thoughts. I reject Schmitt, then, not by fighting him on his own terms, but by pointing out the self-undermining nature of his ideology. This is not because I wish to defeat the Schmittians in a debate or even to persuade them, but to recognize the Nietzschean distinction, far more powerful than Schmitt's, of health and sickness. Schmittian thinking is a fever. It may be that we have to continually reconfront this sickness, but this does not mean we should consider the friend-enemy antagonism a normal or healthy state of affairs. It may be a recurring tendency of human beings, but man is something to be overcome. The political man must therefore pursue affirmative goals and aim for competence in statecraft, prosperity for the people, and rule of law. In those conditions, he can pursue the good, following his judgments of what the good entails, and make experiments in legislating and valuing. The condition of these experiments is the health of the social organism. With Cicero, the truly political man will say, quote, "The health of the people should be the supreme law," end quote. If the political body is healthy, the fever of friend-enemy thinking can be overcome. That concludes my reading of the first two parts of this planned series of essays. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Please let me know your insights, comments, criticism, questions. I'm happy to hear it all. Thank you, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.